Zen is one of the best examples of a philosophy, shall we call it, in which this experience is dominant. Zen, of course, is a Japanese word, and it's spelled Z-E-N. And that is the Japanese way of pronouncing the Chinese word Chan. And this, in turn, is the Chinese way of pronouncing an Indian Sanskrit word, Yāna. And Yāna refers to the kind of experience which has been represented in this circle. Another word for it would be a second Sanskrit term, shunya. And the nearest we can translate shunya in English is emptiness or void. And so we might say this is an experience of the void. Before trying to explain what this is, and you know the funny thing is it really can't be explained because it has to be felt, because it's a transformation of one's basic feeling, one's basic consciousness of life. But I should mention first that it is characteristic of Eastern philosophy to be based on experience rather than ideas. You see, philosophy in the Western world, especially as it's taught in our universities and academies, is mainly a matter of thinking. It's a matter of trying to arrive at certain clear, positive ideas about the nature of man, the nature of the universe, and so on and so forth. And also religion in the West is somewhat similar because religion is largely concerned with belief in certain ideas. In these basic forms of Eastern philosophy, on the other hand, such as Zen, which is a kind of Buddhism, or Taoism, the basic native philosophy of China, or in Vedanta, which is the central form of Indian philosophy, what is basic to them is not ideas, but a way of experiencing, a way of feeling. And this might be called, as it is here, the void, demonstrated by this circle. Because it is not a void which is just emptiness. This isn't the idea that there are people in the backward worlds of Asia who think that the universe is ultimately nothing at all. It is rather that the void represents complete spiritual freedom. Or you might say, if you don't like the word spiritual, complete psychological freedom. And therefore, I want to try, if I can, to communicate to you, to give you some idea of what this experience is. In Japanese, in Zen, it is called satori. I'll write that down. It's an unfamiliar word. S-A-T-O-R-I. And I like the way that that's pronounced in Southern Chinese. They pronounce it because it's something that happens to you suddenly. Now let me try, if I can possibly, to put into some sort of words what this experience is. This experience, which so far as they are concerned, is the objective of human life. To get this is to understand the meaning of human nature and destiny. Only because it's a transformation of consciousness, because it's something you feel rather than something you think, it is for this reason difficult to put into words. But it is as if you saw quite suddenly, and indeed this experience could have happened to you. It can come without warning to anybody, and so what I'm going to be saying may strike a familiar ring in some ears. But it is as if quite suddenly you became totally convinced that the way everything is in this universe and at this moment is absolutely right. And that's almost putting it too weakly. I'm not trying to talk about a sort of Pollyanna feeling where we say, well, this is the best of all possible worlds, and everything, however evil and however wrong, is going to work out all right in the end because it's a means to an end in some master design. I'm not saying that. I'm saying it is suddenly feeling that everything is right the way it is now, however appalling, however terrible. And you know it beyond a shadow of doubt. There are two other aspects to this experience as well. And although you feel them all together, we have to talk about them separately. While the first aspect is feeling that everything just as it is so right that you could say of it, this is why I'm alive. This is what life's all about. The second is that everything you see and feel seems to come to life in an extraordinary way. You feel the world as you've seen it before was seen almost in a dream. But it is as if just the ordinary things that were confronting you suddenly went, yeah, and came alive. And the third aspect of it is that you no longer feel yourself and what you are experiencing to be separated. Although you don't lose the feeling of the outline of your skin, you don't forget that I, or Joe Dokes, is a possible name by which you can refer to yourself. Nevertheless, it suddenly seems to you that your skin is no longer what divides you from the world, it's what joins you to it. What you see outside you is also you. Now, we ordinarily restrict the idea of ego, of I-ness, or of you-ness to some sort of psychological entity or process inside us which is in control of us. And we identify ourselves with a sort of controlling center. But in this experience, it is as if that center were suddenly enlarged to include the whole universe. You almost feel as if you were God, except that in Eastern thought, one doesn't think of God as a kind of omnipotent person. I mean, there are lots of people in our asylums who say, well, I'm God. I always like the story of the woman who insisted that she was God. And to humor her, someone said, well, if you're God, will you please explain how you managed to create the universe in 6 days? She said, I never talk shop. It isn't feeling God in that sense, as if you could do anything. But it is feeling that you and this whole world are one. And that in this experience of oneness and the sudden coming alive of everything, and the profound rightness, that's the only word I can use, the profound rightness of each moment, of this moment, however far it may seem to be short of one's ideals of perfection. This is it. And you say, having seen this, I can die content. This is what it was all about. Now, you might think at the same time that an experience of this kind is rather dangerous. I mean, supposing one did become convinced that everything just as it is the ideal, is right. Would this mean that you could go out and murder some rich relative in order to inherit their fortune? Does it mean you can do anything you like? You can kick your father and mother, you can be cruel to your children, that you can steal and rob and anything? In a way, it does mean that. But that is only to say, isn't it, that we are free. And freedom is dangerous. But yet, freedom is one of the things which we cherish as one of our greatest possessions and privileges. But if we deny ourselves freedom, then we don't really have the power to act morally. Because all true moral acts are not the acts we are bound to do. They are the acts we are free. But freedom is dangerous. The moment you teach a child to walk, you can teach it to kick its mother. The moment you teach a child to use a knife to cut up its steak with, the child can go and kill someone with a knife. Life is risky. life is not safe. And so in the same way, this experience is not safe. But on the other hand, its content is so joyous that when people are profoundly happy, they are not in the mood, usually, to go out and slug someone. And so you might say, this experience, then, which is the foundation of these great forms of Oriental philosophy, that sounds wonderful, and I'd like to get it. You know, that reminds me of a story. Once a fellow was traveling in England, and he'd lost his way and wanted to get to a certain village. And he went to a country yokel and said, can you tell me the way to Little Tuddenham? And the yokel scratched his head and said, well, sir, I do know where that is, but if I were you, I wouldn't start from here. And so in the same way, when one asks, how do I get this experience? That's not quite the right question. And to go out to get it is from the first the wrong approach. Because this sort of transformation of consciousness happens to a person only in the moment when, you might say, they give up grasping. They start to treat life not as something to be grabbed, when their whole approach to things is no longer clutching. You know, it was a basic teaching in Buddhism that the root of all human suffering is clinging or grasping. Just in the same way as I was suggesting on a previous program, that you can't cling to your breath without losing it. You have to let go of your breath. And for that reason, the word that is used in Buddhism for this experience, it's another word familiar to you all, nirvana, literally means blow out. Whew. Don't hang on. Don't clutch life. And so one of the great problems is how on earth to get ourselves to give up clutching, to give up clinging. But you see, if that's something you eagerly want to do because you want to get something good out of it, this is still a grasping attitude. Well, you know, in Zen, they have a means of teaching people how to stop clinging. Zen, incidentally, is supposed to have been brought from India to China around somewhere between 400 and 500 AD by a fierce-looking gentleman called Bodhidharma. You can see him in this picture by the Japanese painter Soga Jasuku. He's always drawn as a very fierce fellow with a twinkle in his eye at the same time. And when Bodhidharma came to China, he didn't have very many disciples, but there was one fellow who sought him out, and his name was Eka. And Eka came to Bodhidharma and said, "Sir, I want you to accept me as your disciple." And Bodhidharma replied, "I have nothing to teach. What I understand is an experience, in other words, and I can't put it into words, and therefore go away, I can't teach it to you." But Eka insisted on being taught, and he waited outside Bodhidharma's cave in the snow. And if you look in the picture by Seshu, you can see Eka standing out there. And Eka got so persistent, and Bodhidharma so persistent in his refusal to teach him, that at last Eka cut off his arm and handed it to Bodhidharma, saying, "Look, here is the testimony of my sincerity. Please take me as your disciple." So Bodhidharma said, "All right, what do you want?" And Eka replied, "I have no peace of mind. Please pacify my mind." And by mind, of course, he meant his soul, his self. So Bodhidharma said, "Bring out your mind here before me. I'll pacify it." But Eka said, "When I look for my mind, I can't find it." Bodhidharma said, "There, I have pacified your mind. And at that moment, Eka had his Satori. In other words, he had the experience I've tried to describe to you. Because Bodhidharma made him really struggle to catch hold of himself, to find that separate ego, that controlling center, which all of us tend to believe ourselves to be. But you know, when you look for it, you can't find it. It's like, they say lunatics sometimes sitting in an asylum are doing this. Yes, they sit for hours perhaps in a padded cell doing that, but you can't catch hold of it. You know, perhaps one of the good ways of showing you what this means is through the application of Zen to Japanese fencing. You know, Japanese fencing, or kendo, which means the way of the sword, is done with gruesome swords like this. And the samurai, Japanese feudal soldiery, used to practice Zen to give them courage, and they applied it to the art of fencing. Now, if you go to study with a Japanese fencing master, you will not at first be given a sword and be told how to use it. You'll be made a kind of janitor around the house. You have to do all the little chores, like sweeping the floors, putting away the bedding, washing up the dishes, and so on and so forth. And while you are doing that, the master will get hold of a practice sword. This, you see, is made of bamboo. It's made of about 6 slips of bamboo loosely tied together, so that if you get hit with it, although it may give you a pretty hard crack, at least you don't get killed. And while the poor boy, who's the apprentice, is doing the household duties, the teacher stalks around with one of these things and unawares gives him a bang on the head. And the boy is expected to defend himself by any means at his disposal. If he's got a saucepan in his hand, use the saucepan. If he's picking up a cushion, use the cushion. And everywhere, always at unknown moments, the teacher sneaks up on him and bangs him on the head. So after a while, the poor fellow is going around, looking this way and looking that, expecting at any moment the teacher to hit him. And he begins in his mind to plan how he can be ready to meet the teacher's assault. And as he goes along a passage, he's expecting the teacher to come right round the corner at the end. And instead of that, just as he's all ready to defend himself, doing, he gets hit on the head from behind. Now, when this has been going on for a little time, there are only 2 possibilities. The apprentice gets a nervous breakdown, quits, or he learns. And what does he learn? He learns that the teacher will always outwit him, that he can never be prepared for an unexpected attack. And so he gives up trying to control the situation. He gives up trying to prepare. In other words, he just wanders around, just like this. Oh, maybe it hits, maybe it doesn't. He gives up caring whether he's going to get hit or not. And at that moment, the teacher gives him the practice sword and says, now you can begin to learn fencing. Because the importance of this is simple. That if, say, you're faced with a group of attackers, and you don't know where the next attack is coming from, if you are ready to go for this fellow, and this one is going to come at you, and you're all set to go for him, you have to withdraw from here to go here. But if you're in a middle position, and you're not tensed in mind in any particular direction, you're ready to go in all directions, wherever the attack may come from. And so in exactly the same way, the Zen way of teaching teaches one to see that you cannot be in complete control of your whole life situation. You cannot, in other words, fundamentally possess yourself. And so they set you the problem of trying to find out who you are. Who is the knower behind all your experience? Who is the experience? Who is the ego, the I? And they make you search for it and search for it and search for it. Or you could put this in another way. They ask you, and this really amounts to the same thing, Act with total sincerity. Show me, in the Zen way of putting it, who you were before your father and mother conceived you. In other words, show me your real, basic, original self. And this means perform an absolutely 100% genuine and sincere act. Well, you know how it is when you try to be sincere. When you try to be natural. You know jolly well that you're trying and that everything you do is a fake. So in the same way, Zen student finds out that he cannot act 100% genuinely with his whole being. And he gets frustrated again and again and again as the teacher rejects every attempt he makes to show him his real self. Until the moment comes when he suddenly realizes, not just as an idea, but something that he knows in his whole body, he knows with his very bones, that it can't be done. You cannot intentionally be natural. And he gives up. And that moment of giving up is just the same as when the student of the sword gives up trying to prepare to defend himself. And in the moment when we let go of ourselves in that way, zoop, there comes upon us this experience of the void, of complete freedom, or as we might say in psychological language, being free from blocking. You know, blocking is when you are stalled by something. When somebody says something to you that fundamentally embarrasses you, or when an event happens in life which, as it were, knocks the wind out of your sails, you are blocked. And to be free from blocking, to be free from being stopped, being phased, is part of the Satori experience. To be able to go straight ahead, as it were, going with the stream of life and not trying to resist the stream. Just as, for example, if you were actually swimming, you got caught in a strong current. If you try to swim against it, you're perfectly sure to drown. But you have to learn in that situation. Turn round and go with the stream, let it carry you, and then in that moment, you and the stream become one. The whole force of the stream becomes one with your own body. And you learn after that how to use the force of the stream, to edge to the side and get out of it in that way. This, of course, is the philosophy of judo, of the gentle way, a philosophy of self-defense in which Zen Buddhism has had a great influence. So then, when the moment of letting go comes, when we see that every moment of life is now it. In other words, the object of life is no longer seen as something to grasp after in the future. Every moment is it now. Every moment, even the most trivial, answers the question, what is life for? And so you see, the experience at the basis of Zen and at the basis of other types of Oriental philosophy can be demonstrated by ordinary everyday life. That's why in Zen teaching, those old masters in China didn't like to answer questions about philosophy with wordy explanations. They had quite a different way of going about it. I remember one case where a Confucian scholar came to a teacher and said, please explain to me your secret teaching. And the teacher replied, well, there's a saying in your own master Confucius, which very well puts it. When Confucius said, my disciples, do you think I am holding anything back from you? Indeed, I am holding nothing back. And that was all he said. And so the Confucian scholar was a bit perturbed and said, well, what do you mean? And the Zen teacher said, well, forget it. I don't want to talk about it anymore. Well, a few days later, they were walking together in the mountains, and they happened to pass a bush of wild laurel. And the Zen teacher turned to the Confucian scholar and said, do you smell it? The scholar said, yes. You see, said the teacher, I'm keeping nothing back from you. And it said that at that moment, the scholar was awakened. This is the characteristic approach of Zen, to answer questions about abstract, vast matters of philosophy with absolutely concrete, momentary events. Because it is these concrete, momentary events that are the answer. If they are experienced with a mind that is no longer clinging to life and clinging to itself, as I said, the trivial, the ordinary, the momentary suddenly comes zoop to life. And this, you see, this thing that we are living now is the answer. And so Zen teachers have said very strange things when asked philosophical questions. One of them said, the cypress tree in the yard. Another said, 3 pounds of flax. Another said, it's windy again this morning. Sometimes they don't say anything. There's a famous story of a Chinese general, I think he was, who came to one of the old masters and said to him, what is the way? And in answer, the master teacher said, I don't understand. The master said, cloud in the sky, water in the jar. I have often puzzled and puzzled about what it must be like to go to sleep and never wake up, to be simply not there forever and ever. After all, one has some intimation of this by the interval that separates going to sleep from waking, when we don't have any dreams but go to sleep, and then suddenly we're there again, and in the interim there was nothing. And if there was never any end to that interval, if the waking up didn't happen, that's such a curious thought. And yet, you know, I believe that although that's rather gloomy kind of consideration, I found that's one of the most creative thoughts I ever thought in my life. And I keep going back to it. You know, it's in line with a lot of the very fundamental questions that children ask. When they say, Mummy, who would I have been if you had married someone else? These are the kind of questions that make us puzzle profoundly about our existence. And one of the reasons why I think thinking about not being, about total non-existence, is so creative, is that in comparison with that thought, the fact that we are seems kind of queer, incredibly odd. But you know, in the Western world, I suppose we have two dominant ideas about what happens to us when we die. There's the old-fashioned idea that after we die, we go to another world. I say old-fashioned, not to say it's out of date. We don't know what the answer to this is. But that's the traditional answer of the Western world. When you die, you go to another life. Maybe heaven, maybe purgatory, maybe hell, who knows? I think nowadays, though, the more general idea, the more plausible idea to many people, is that when we die, we just cease to be. That's all there is to it. But we're inclined, I think, to have in our minds a picture of this, which indeed is depressing, of being shut up in the dark for always and always and always, to be kind of buried alive in a blackness, where we are blind, deaf, and dumb, but somehow still conscious. But in the Eastern world, there are different ideas of this. The major Eastern idea is what is generally known as reincarnation, of going through life after life after life in an endless series, a process that is represented in this Japanese print of the Wheel of Life, the Buddhist Wheel of Life. This painting was lent to me by Mr. and Mrs. Imamura of Berkeley in California, who used to be the priest of the Berkeley Buddhist Church. And it shows the wheel of stages of existence through which beings pass, clutched by the great demon of impermanence. This is rather an unusual representation of the Wheel of Life. Perhaps some of you have seen these before. They usually have 6 divisions in the central part of the wheel here, and this one happens to have 5, and it's the Chinese-Japanese version of the Buddhist Wheel of Life, whereas I think prints in books, I know there was one some years ago in Life magazine, usually show the Tibetan version. But what we have here, and I think what I'll do, is I'll explain to begin with the popular interpretation of it, and then go on to see what more philosophical Buddhists think of it in a deeper way. These then are the 5 or sometimes 6 realms of existence through which, as I said, beings pass through their various lives. We could start here, for example. This is the human world. And then next to this is the world of the Devas, D-E-V-A, which we would translate into English as angel. Then this is the world of the animals. This is the world that is sometimes called the hells, only that's not quite a correct term for it. It should be called the world of the purgatories, because in this scheme of the universe, there is no everlasting state. There is no everlasting heaven, and there is no everlasting hell. The demon of impermanence clutches the whole thing, and they all terminate. Next to the hells, there is the realm of what are called pretas, P-R-E-T-A. They are frustrated spirits, sometimes shown with very large stomachs and very tiny mouths, enormous appetite, but very small means of satisfying. And the idea is, you see, that in the course of his development, the individual goes through life after life. If he does well, he ascends towards the heavens. If he does ill, he descends to the hells. Or he may fall from the human state to the animal state, or fall from the human state to the state of the ghosts. But the point that has to be remembered in the Buddhist idea of transmigration or reincarnation is that you can never stop anywhere. You may ascend to heaven, but what goes up must eventually come down. You may descend to hell, but what goes down must eventually come up. And so one goes on and on, moving through these various worlds until, in Buddhist ideas, you become sufficiently awakened to become a Buddha, one who is released from the wheel, and who does not fall anymore into the sequence of rebirths, but enters the eternal state of nirvana. Now, if you will look closer again, you will see that there are a number of figures round the outside of the wheel. And these represent what is called the 12-fold chain of dependent origination. That is to say, they are a series of links which form what might be called the sequence of life. They are, as it were, a schematic diagram of the force or the process that keeps this wheel rotating. And the chain starts with a demon down at the bottom here, who represents ignorance, or perhaps unconsciousness, the state of not knowing. Then next in order, you'll see a potter's wheel. And this represents potentialities of life. Next comes a monkey, who represents consciousness. A man in a boat. For some reason, this represents the combination of name and form. Words bringing out shapes. Words identifying shapes and things in the world. Here comes sense consciousness, the five senses, a man's body with the senses exposed. And here comes contact, a pair of lovers. After this, there comes perception. I am not quite sure what the symbol in this wheel is. It seems to show a man with a sword behind a screen and two women playing in front of the screen. The usual symbol you find here for perception is a man with an arrow in his eye, showing the pain involved in the perception of the world. The next in the link is desire. It shows a woman with twins. The next one here is called grasping, and that shows a man with a basket into which he is trying to get the fruits of life. And then as we come over round the wheel, we get a figure which means growth. I think this is one of the gods of prosperity. But it means growth, the fullness of life. Here is birth, a woman in parturition. Here is old age. And then, although the final stage of the links of dependent origination, as they are usually drawn, shows this one as the last and calls it old age and death, in this particular wheel they've been spread out so that you get old age, grief. No, excuse me, this is sickness. Old age, sickness, death, grief, compassion, suffering, and again back into ignorance. Here's another figure of ignorance, the camel being led by a blind man. Now, what I want you to notice particularly about this is that the chain represents what is called in Sanskrit the process of karma. I'm going to write that word because it's very fundamental to an understanding of this whole problem. Karma is sometimes understood, and maybe your ordinary dictionaries give it to you, as the law of cause and effect, but actually it comes from the root kri, which in Sanskrit means to act or to do. And the basic idea of karma is that it is action which always involves the necessity for other action. As the Buddha once expressed it, this arises, that becomes. Now, this isn't quite the same thing as cause and effect. It is rather the idea of linkage. For example, when I pick up this brush, I lift it by one end, and the other end comes up. Now, we could say this is cause and effect, although this would be a rather cumbersome way of thinking about it. I could say, for example, that the coming up of the brush at this end is the effect of the cause, my lifting it at this end. But we don't ordinarily think so complicatedly about it. We think in a simpler fashion, namely, that to pick up this end is also to lift up that end because it's all one. So in the same way, Buddhists and Hindus who follow the idea of karma believe that life and death involve each other in the same way that the two ends of the brush, lifting up one involves lifting up the other. So in this way, living involves dying. We wouldn't say that the cause of death is birth, but birth and death go together and they are inseparable. And so if we will look again for a moment at the wheel, we can see that there are these important phases of it altogether. Here it ends with the sequence of pictures representing death and suffering and its attendant grief, ending in the blind man leading the camel and the demon, which together represent ignorance or unconsciousness. But once again here we have the potentiality of life, and then the monkey representing consciousness. All these things are looked upon as linked and therefore inseparable. And thus, you see, we don't look upon ignorance as the first step or the first link in the chain from a chronological point of view. We only start numbering the chain, the steps of the chain here, because one has to begin somewhere when one's talking. And so, the basic idea of this link is interrelatedness, interlockedness, so that death and life, as I said, imply each other. So that you might, speaking from the standpoint of Indian philosophy, of Hinduism, of Buddhism, you might pick an argument with Hamlet and say, to be or not to be is not the question. These are not alternatives. They are things that go together just like up and down, back and front, solid and space. Now there's another aspect of karma which needs to be considered here, and that is that karma also involves the idea of the continuity of pattern. You know, strictly speaking, Buddhists don't believe that there is any soul entity which passes from one life to another. There is no sort of fixed I or fixed ego which once was an animal and then became a man and then became an angel and then eventually became a Buddha or something like that. The idea of karma as the linking factor between the various lives is what we might call continuity of pattern. For example, consider an army regiment. A certain regiment goes on year after year after year. Old European regiments, for example, have existed for hundreds of years. And yet the personnel of those regiments and even the barracks in which they are stationed are entirely changed. In the same way, a university. Harvard University has existed for a long time. Oxford for a lot longer. And yet there is not a single member of the faculty, not a single student who was there when it first began. And yet, you see, the university goes on. Because what goes on is a pattern, a form of life. In the same way, the individual body of man, every 7 years, I think, all the molecules composing our physical structure are entirely changed. And yet, something identifiable as the pattern, which we associate with Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so, is still there. Another fascinating illustration of continuity of pattern in a sense is wave motion. It's perhaps easiest to illustrate with something like a barber's pole. When you twirl it. Now, as you twirl it, there's an illusion of something moving upwards from the bottom to the top of the pole. It seems that the strips go along. Now, actually, they don't go along. They just go round. And in the same way, also, when waves move across water, there's no water moving across. There is the wave pattern moving across. The water is just going up and down, as you can tell when you see, say, a dead leaf floating on the water's surface, and it isn't moved along by the wave. So this idea of continuity of pattern is the solution which Indian philosophy offers on the matter of the problem of death. The individual, as it were, entity is constantly changing. He does not go on, but the pattern or the karma, the pattern of action goes on. And it's all embraced by that figure you saw of the great demon of impermanence. Could we look at that demon once again? I want to say something more about it. from our Western ideas, this fellow looks pretty evil. And we might associate him with the devil in the Hebrew or Christian sense of a principle of evil. In Buddhism, demons are not evil. They are really beneficent. They have a frightening aspect, but underneath this, there is a deeper meaning. This demon represents change or impermanence. But the deep insight underlying this is that change is a liberating factor. Death is a liberating factor. Did it not exist, life would not exist either. And therefore the wise man is not afraid of the demon. He goes, as it were, straight forward to him to embrace him. And at that moment, the demon is transformed. And so in the same way, in a deeper sense, Buddhists do not think of these various realms of the wheel as literal worlds where there are angels and demons and starved ghosts, but they represent the various phases of consciousness. Equanimity, general kind of medium consciousness, quiet consciousness is the human state. The angel state is supreme happiness. The animal state is animality. Here is misery in its extreme, and here is frustration in its extreme. But the fundamental idea of the whole wheel that we have to remember, the idea of karma, is the interlocking, the interdependence of being and not being, of death and life, and the fact that the demon of change is really a disguise of the very source of life, the death without which life is impossible, the change without which life is totally boring. Now, of course, when any idea like that is explained, the first thing that we ask is it true? Is there a process of rebirth? Do our patterns go on and have influence to an illimitable future? But you know, as this idea is held by deeply thoughtful Hindus and Buddhists, it isn't a belief in something which we can't prove. It's really quite a self-evident notion. Think of it in this way. Supposing I make two statements. Statement one: after I die, I shall be reborn again as a baby, but I shall forget my former life. Statement two: after I die, a baby will be born. Now, I believe that those two statements are saying exactly the same thing. And we know that the second one is true. Babies are always being born. Conscious beings of all kinds are constantly coming into existence after others die. But why would I think that the two statements are really the same statement? Because after all, if you die and your memory comes to an end, and you forget who you were, being reborn again is exactly the equivalent of somebody else being born, because we have no consciousness of our continuity unless we have memory. If the memory goes, then we might just as well be somebody else. But it seems to me that the fascinating thing about this is that although a particular set of memories vanishes, death is not the end of consciousness. In other words, we are deluded by a kind of fantasy if we think of death as endless darkness. Endless nothingness is not only inconceivable, but it's logically absolutely meaningless, because we aren't able to have any idea, much less sensation of nothing, unless it can be compared with a sensation of something. These two things go together. And therefore, I think what is meant is that the vacuum created by the disappearance of a being, by the disappearance of his memory system, is simply filled by another being who is I, just as you feel you're I. The funny thing, though, about being I, about feeling that one is sort of a center of the universe, is that you can only experience this I sensation in the singular. You can't experience being two or three I's all at the same time. Now then, it seems to me that this idea has three very important consequences. One is that the disappearance of our memory in death is not really something to be regretted. Of course, everybody wishes to hold forever to the memories and to the people and the situations that he particularly loves. But surely, if we think this through, is that what we actually want? Do we really want to have those we love, however greatly we love them, for always and always and always and always? Isn't it inconceivable that even in a very distant future, we wouldn't get tired of it? And this indeed is the secret of the thing. This is why the demon of impermanence is beneficent. Because it is forgetting about things that renews their wonder. Just think, when you opened your eyes on the world for the first time as a child, how brilliant colors were. What a jewel the sun was. What marvels the stars. How incredibly alive the trees were. That's all because they were new to your eyes. Or in the same way, you know how it is, you've been reading a mystery story. And you're looking around the house, you want something to read, you pick up an old mystery story. If you read it years and years ago and you've forgotten all about the plot, it still excites you. But if you remember the plot, it doesn't excite you. And so, by the dispensation of forgetting, the world is constantly renewed. And we are able to see it again and again, and to love again and again, to have people to whom we are deeply attached and deeply fond, always with renewed intensity, and without the contrast of having seen them before, for always and always and always. Another consequence of this is a very curious realization. Remember that question, who would I be if my mother had married someone else? Who, if I were you, we often say. One might so easily have been you. I might so easily have been born in China and India. Why do I feel that the world is centered in this place, as distinct from some other place? You jolly well know the world is centered where you are. And this gives one a very strange feeling of the idea that other people jolly well exist in the same sense you do. Everybody's name is I. That's what you call yourself. So there will always be I's in the world. Every I is in a way the same I. We all might be anyone else. And there is no escape. It goes on and on and on and on. So long as there is consciousness anywhere, there is I. You then, in a way, look out through all eyes. And that, perhaps, is the secret of the great virtue of compassion. every eye is in a way the same eye. We all might be anyone else.